At 0857, just outside the Balashika military district, morning stillness fractured. Ukrainian F-16s came in low at 200 feet, flares trailing like white comets, while Neptune missiles arced in from nearly 100 miles away. Recon drones scrambled Russian radars, and Leopard UGVs crept toward fortified bunkers. It was not a warning shot. It was a full-spectrum breach aimed at Moscow's eastern gate. Within moments, command centers burned, fuel depots detonated, and air defenses blinked offline.
The aerial barrage opened space for the ground drive. PT-91 tanks rolled in from the southeast, engines grumbling through industrial ruins. At their flanks moved Leopard ground robots, compact UGVs with mine sensors and signal jammers. They disrupted sensor nets, sniffed out buried explosives, and fed fire coordinates back to rocket artillery waiting behind the line. Infantry flowed through maintenance corridors and shattered walkways, using FPV drones to peer around every corner and to mark choke points. The assault moved like a surgeon's blade, quiet, deliberate, and precise. Russian response was instant and brutal. T-80BV tanks and MTLB transports poured from northern alleys, throwing overlapping fields of fire between warehouses and cramped housing blocks. Urban geometry favored weight and numbers on paper, but the fight in the streets favored speed and adaptation. Ukrainian loitering munitions, guided by heat and motion, dove between buildings to strike relay trucks and relay nodes, shredding command cohesion. Close-quarters fights erupted. Shells ricocheted off rough concrete, drone motors screamed overhead, and every intersection became a micro-battlefield. Where the Russians sought to blunt the advance with brute force, Ukraine turned the city into a knife fight and dictated the timing. At 0932, Ukrainian armor and UGVs pushed deeper into Balashika's outskirts. Russia launched a counterpunch, a pair of Mi-35M gunships with Su-25 strike support streaming from a nearby base. They dove low and hard toward the spearhead near a ruined tram depot, intent on shredding the PT-91s. But the newly deployed Iris TLS detection array had eyes. Recon drones had eyes. Two missiles rose and found the incoming rotors. In under 90 seconds, both gunships cartwheeled into the tree line in flames. The regional sky, already crowded, convulsed. The surviving Su-25s hugged treetops and roofs, trying to thread corridors that radar couldn't see. They met F-16s circling at altitude, AIM-120s reaching beyond visual range. One Russian jet peeled off, flares blooming, while another took a direct hit and spun into a warehouse district. The afternoon sky over Balashika became layered. Low scouts skimming rooflines, interceptors high and patient, jets screaming through the middle. It became a three-dimensional slaughterhouse, brutal, fast, decisive. With every downed chopper and aborted sortie, Ukraine tightened its dome of air denial over the corridor. Even so, the ground fight hardened. From the west, two S-3 Akatsiya howitzers and BM-30 Smerch batteries laid down thunderous barrages to crack Ukrainian logistics. The first salvos cratered roads and overturned supply trucks. A mobile Ukrainian EW unit burned near a refuel point. A steel and flame wall threatened to freeze Ukrainian momentum, but the battle had become algorithmic. Eyes in the sky fed digits and geometry to guns on the ground. Recon drones with thermal optics tracked launch arcs, triangulated plume signatures, and painted battery positions. Counter-battery doctrine executed in minutes. RM-70 Vampire systems outside rocket range launched coordinated 122mm salvos, while kamikaze J-22 drones threaded through smoke to strike command nodes. Within 7 minutes, 2 artillery teams were wrecked, ammunition cooking off, launchers burning. The rear fire screen collapsed, supply corridors unclogged. Ukraine's tempo accelerated. With artillery suppressed, Ukraine aimed for the nerve center, a suspected Russian command post concealed beneath Building 8 in the urban core. Rather than a broad infantry hammer, they opted for precision, Under smoke and ECM cover, a small special operations team infiltrated through drainage culverts and service stairwells. Tiny bird-sized drones slipped through windows and vents, feeding thermal maps to handsets. Robotic demolition units, four-wheeled bots carrying shaped charges, rolled into position. At 10:41 a.m., controlled explosions collapsed key sublevels. The structure above remained standing, but the underground nodes, encrypted racks, relay boxes, and radio cores were crushed. Communications in the sector went dark, vehicles repositioned without orders. In a quarter of an hour, the enemy's nerve was severed. The Russian reaction from the north was predictable and furious. Concealed staging zones 6 miles north disgorged a column of T-80Bs and towed artillery in a broad pincer aimed to split the Ukrainian axis. Their plan? Push hard while Kyiv consolidated gains. But the Ukrainians had set traps. FPV teams ran ultra-low approaches, 10 to 15 feet off the ground, popping up to hammer lead vehicles before they reached intersections. 3 Russian tanks were disabled before they reached the outer ring. Those that advanced ran into a triangle clamp tactic, ambush fires from perpendicular alley cuts, while infantry with ATGMs punished exposed flanks. An attempted flank through an industrial lot hit UGV-laid minefields and gridlocked the column. Helicopter support faltered under persistent EW interference, and by the time air cover engaged, Iris-T batteries had already shot down a chopper and forced another to abort. In less than 30 minutes, the northern push collapsed into retreat. Abandoned tanks smoked in the streets, trucks burned, and infantry scattered. Ukraine had not only blunted the counterattack, it had absorbed and turned it into a killing zone. The initiative slipped from Moscow's grasp. As Russian forces attempted to fall back, Ukraine tightened the net. Buval and Banshee EW vehicles moved into pre-planned jamming positions and severed outbound Russian comms. Radio, satellite, encrypted relays, all fell into silence. Neptune drones performed deception loops along retreat axes, spoofing radar returns and creating the illusion of armor where none existed. In the confusion, friendly fire incidents occurred. Russian crews fired on their own convoys, mistaking them for UAVs. From rooftops and stairwells, Ukrainian squads established overwatch on the M7 highway, building kill zones. Snipers and grenade teams picked off exposed crews. What had begun as an orderly withdrawal became a rout. At 6:48 a.m., a pale fog hugged the edge of Kubinka Air Base just west of Moscow. The stillness shattered as 6 Russian M28 gunships and Su-34 strike jets thundered in, unleashing a storm of rockets at what appeared to be a Ukrainian tank column. But there were no tanks, only heat signatures projected by Rattle-S drones. In less than 60 seconds, millions of rubles of Russian firepower vanished into a digital illusion. Ukraine had tricked one of Russia's most secure military sites, and the real assault was only beginning. Scene 1. The drone deception. Moments later, a swarm of Ukrainian reconnaissance drones swept in low over the base. Lele 100s, Spectator M1s, and loitering Punisher units gliding silently under radar cover. Their mission: locate Russia's communication hubs and blind the air defenses before a single shell was fired. Within minutes, micro-explosions rippled across Kubinka's southern depot as relay trucks, antennas, and mobile radar towers were shredded. Then came a new wave, electronic fog rolling across the base from jammers hidden in nearby woods. Kubinka's radar went dark. For the first time in its history, the heart of Russia's air defense network was flying blind. Scene 2. The ground assault. Out of the mist, 6 Ukrainian PT-91 tanks surged forward, flanked by Rotel S unmanned ground vehicles. The drones swept for mines and deployed smoke, guiding the armored column through the chaos. Russian defenders scrambled. Boomerang IFVs and T-80 BVM tanks rolled from behind museum walls, where Soviet-era exhibits once stood, and used underground tunnels to flank the Ukrainian spearhead. The battlefield transformed into a maze of fire. Shells exploded between rusted World War II armor and Cold War relics. Amid the chaos, a single Ukrainian tank pivoted behind a wrecked IS-2 exhibit and took out a boomerang in one precise shot. Within 11 minutes, Ukraine had punched a hole through Kubinka's southeast quadrant. 50 miles west, 2 HIMARS launchers came online. Their guided rockets soared toward Kubinka's eastern bunkers, where radar nodes, Iskander missile trucks, and fuel stores were hidden. The impacts were devastating. One warehouse ignited like a volcano. Another bunker collapsed inward, crushing its crew. Kubinka's power grid failed. Command channels went silent. And then came the aerial assault. 4 Su-25 skimmed treetop level, dropping laser-guided bombs on surveillance towers and perimeter sensors. The once fortified base was crumbling into static and smoke. Desperate Russian operators fired Buk M2 missiles and launched Iskander M strikes at phantom targets, but the radar images were false. Ukrainian decoy drones and radar-absorbing smoke had turned the base into a hall of mirrors. Each Russian missile detonated harmlessly in empty fields. On the ground, Ukrainian infantry advanced under cover of smoke, guided by crawling scout robots, tiny machines feeding thermal images from underground corridors. Russian marker UGVs and BTR-82s counterattacked near the museum's east wing, but FPV kamikaze drones tore through them like hornets, exploding on impact. Within minutes, Kubinka's defenders were forced into retreat, their command systems severed. Scene 5. The Kill Strike. Hidden beneath a grassy rise, Ukraine located the Eastern Coordination Node, Kubinka's underground command bunker. A high-altitude UJ-26 UAV released a single glide bomb through its ventilation shaft. The warhead punched deep and detonated directly above the relay room. Instant blackout. Kubinka's operational nerve was dead. Moments later, 6 miles north, a rail line erupted. Charges planted earlier by Ukrainian saboteurs destroyed an incoming supply train. The message was clear. Kubinka was no longer a functioning base. It was a tomb of burning steel. Transition. The fire spread south. But the war was not finished. At 4:17 a.m., hundreds of miles away, the skies above Saki Air Base in Crimea erupted. A swarm of Ukrainian drones plunged through Russia's layered defenses. Panzer's S-1 fired blindly. S-400s launched interceptors, but the sheer volume overwhelmed them. Fuel depots ignited. 5 Su-37 fighters were reduced to molten wreckage within 3 minutes. Russian MiG-29s scrambled to intercept, but Ukrainian jets met them head-on. Above the burning base, dogfights ripped across the dawn sky, while Patriot systems locked onto any Russian aircraft that dared cross the line. For the first time, Crimea's skies no longer belonged to Moscow. Far below, in the Black Sea, a Russian submarine surfaced and fired cruise missiles toward Ukraine's supply lines, an attempt to cut off the offensive. But Kyiv's response came fast. A swarm of unmanned surface vessels raced across the waves, each loaded with explosives. One struck a Russian corvette broadside, tearing it in half. Another exploded beneath a frigate's hull. The Black Sea itself became a weapon, fast, silent, and unstoppable.
Scene 7. The Final Wave. Back at Saki, Russia tried to rearm its S-400 systems, desperate to regain control. But Ukraine's electronic jammers blanketed the spectrum, turning radars into static. Then came the final blow. A barrage of long-range rockets streaked through the night, hammering the munitions depots. The entire base erupted into a rolling inferno, warehouses, hangars, and fuel trucks exploding one after another. Within an hour, Saki ceased to exist. Scene 8. The Strike on Moscow. In the wake of the chaos, Ukraine executed its boldest move yet. A long-range missile struck deep inside Moscow, hitting the Russian Ministry of Defense. The explosion shattered windows across the district and shocked Kremlin leadership to its core. For the first time since the war began, the capital itself was touched by fire. Kubinka lay silent. Saki burned. And Moscow trembled. Ukraine had demonstrated a terrifying truth. Modern war isn't fought by numbers, but by intelligence, precision, and timing. 3 bases fallen, 1 empire shaken. As dawn broke over the ruins of Kubinka, a lone drone hovered above a burned-out tank. On its fuselage, someone had painted 6 words: "We study the past to rewrite the future." Like, share, and comment your thoughts. Was this the turning point, or just the beginning of something far greater? September 12th, 2025, 12:25 a.m. The Baltic night was cold and silent over the Primorsk oil port. 2 enormous tankers, Captain Loeb and Sergei Gorshkov, stood waiting, their bellies ready to fill with millions of barrels of crude oil bound for the Shadow Fleet. But hundreds of kilometers away, deep inside southern Russia, a quiet alarm began to hum. On the radar screens of a Nebo M long-range VHF station, strange signals appeared. 70 faint echoes, each moving fast and low, their radar signatures barely visible. Moments later, confirmation came from the 91N6E Big Bird surveillance radar. Multiple unidentified contacts, low altitude, inbound from the southwest. Russian operators froze. Then came the sirens. The sky over Leningrad Oblast was about to ignite. The blueprint of deception. The roots of this attack lay months earlier in a dimly lit room in Kiev, where Ukrainian planners faced a cruel equation: to hit a target 1,000 kilometers deep inside Russia, through the densest A2-AD air defense bubble on Earth. To succeed, they would have to turn Russian strength against itself. The solution was as elegant as it was deadly: a grand deception. Ukraine would flood Russia's skies with decoys, cheap, disposable, and fast, forcing Russian radars to chase ghosts, while the real killers slipped through the cracks. When the first radar blips appeared that night, Russian generals felt no panic. This was exactly what their S-400s were built for. Across St. Petersburg and Leningrad Oblast, missile batteries came alive. Gravestone engagement radars locked on targets. Pantsir S-1s unleashed barrages of 30mm cannon fire, and Buck systems scanned for survivors. The air was soon thick with fire and steel. But this wasn't chaos, it was choreography. Ukraine had drawn a map of Russia's defenses and was playing them like a symphony. The villages of Zelyosk, Tosno, Pokrovsko, and Usmino, names no one had ever heard, became beacons luring Russia's might away from the real target, Primorsk. The calm before the collapse. In a bunker near Gachna, a young Russian lieutenant reported the last drone in his sector destroyed. "Sector clear," he said. "All targets neutralized." That message climbed the chain of command, straight into the jaws of a trap. Unseen by the radar, a smaller formation, 7 UJ-26 Bober ER drones, was gliding just above the tree line, weaving through the chaos. They were the assassins. Unlike the wooden decoys that had been sacrificed, these were specialized machines, modified for range, carrying extended fuel tanks and 40-kilogram armor-piercing warheads. Escorting them were the Banshee 7 EW drones, their long-range bodies packed not with explosives, but with electronic warfare pods and antennae. Their mission? To blind the enemy, jam the radars, and escort the Bobers to their target, 1,000 kilometers deep inside Russia. Secret Ukrainian launch sites. Flying low over rivers, forests, and valleys, they hugged the terrain, silent shadows following preloaded digital maps. A few fell, crashing into the dark wilderness. Others pressed on. For hours, they flew without a signal, their paths invisible to Russian radar. Then, as dawn crept across the horizon, the first Russian systems awoke, and Ukraine's trap sprang shut. The Big Bird radar prioritized what it thought were the main threats: the 35 decoy drones rushing towards St. Petersburg. Missiles streaked upward, shredding plywood bodies in flashes of light. The Russians cheered. But the real killers, the 7 Bober ERs, had already crossed the border, invisible beneath the radar floor, escorted by their electronic shadows. The first contact. Near Volosovsky, a Panzer CS-1 locked on to a target, a lone Bober, steady and confident. On the operator's screen, telemetry flickered. Target captured, range steady. He pressed to fire, and the screen turned white. The Banshee 7, flying nearby, had unleashed a wall of jamming energy so intense it erased the radar's vision. The lock vanished, the cannons fired blindly, and the drone slipped through into the dark. This dance repeated again and again across Leningrad Oblast. By dawn, 33 drones lay shattered in the fields and forests. But for Ukraine, every drone lost was another door opened. And through that door flew the 7 that mattered most. The descent into fire. 4:45 a.m., Primorsk-Omel-Port. Inside the coastal defense shelter, a sudden burst of blips appeared on radar. 7 small dots, closing fast. Panic. Missiles fired. 57 E-6 interceptors arcing upward. Too close. Too low. Too fast. The drones split mid-flight, 3 diving toward the main pumping station, 4 veering for the tankers at dock. The first boober struck the control building, its thermobaric warhead sucking every molecule of oxygen from the room before detonating in a rolling inferno. The second plunged into the pipeline manifold, shattering the arteries of the port. And then the tankers were hit. The Captain Loeb took the first blow, its bridge obliterated, electronic systems fried, followed by an explosion that tore open a cargo tank, releasing a geyser of burning oil. Moments later, the Sergei Gorshkov was struck twice, once in the engine room, then at the loading manifolds. Both ships were engulfed in fire. The 2 tankers, Kusto and Kailun, each over 110,000 tons, became twin pillars of flame rising over the Baltic coast. Within 40 seconds, Pumping Station 2 collapsed and Primorsk vanished beneath a cloud of smoke and fire so vast it was visible from orbit. The illusion of victory. By morning, the Russian Ministry of Defense claimed victory. 221 Ukrainian drones destroyed, they announced. All attacks repelled. But satellite images told another story. The port of Primorsk was gone. 2 tankers burned to their keels. Billions of dollars in damage. 20% of Russia's oil export capacity wiped off the map. Each ship had been part of Russia's shadow fleet, used to dodge international sanctions. Each carried 700,000 barrels of oil. In one night, Russia had lost nearly $80 million in revenue per day of halted flow. The dominoes fall. At Pulkovo Airport in St. Petersburg, chaos spread. 11 aircraft diverted. Civilian and military control systems flooded with ghost signals. Across the region, falling debris from downed drones triggered evacuation sirens. Radar operators stared at screens filled with clutter, real and fake targets indistinguishable. The deception was total. Even as the fires consumed Primorsk, Russian air defenses were still firing at phantoms above the city, the anatomy of a perfect strike. When analysts later dissected the attack, they found 2 classes of UAVs. One built to deceive, the other to destroy. The decoys overwhelmed decision systems. The EW platforms like Banshee 7 didn't blind radars completely, they corrupted them, flooding them with false echoes until no one could tell what was real. Captured wreckage around St. Petersburg showed advanced navigation software, proof that these machines hadn't just flown to strike, but to manipulate.
Russia's vast defense web, Kronstadt Naval Base, Luga Artillery Line, Pushkin Command Centers, had been trained to look outward. The attack came from within, from the blind angles they'd never guarded the moment the curtain fell. The official records, the radars had worked, the systems had responded, yet the geometry of war had shifted. Low-altitude drones flying under the radar horizon had outrun even the S-400s. By the time detection came, the targets were already upon them, mere seconds from impact. Primorsk, thought to be one of Russia's most secure ports, was burning because of a flaw in human thinking, not in machinery. The defenders looked outward, but the danger came from beneath, within, and unseen. Aftermath.
By sunrise, the sea was black with oil. The air shimmered with heat and smoke. The port that once funneled $15 billion of annual exports was now a graveyard of steel. Ukraine hadn't just struck a military target. It had struck the foundation of Russia's war economy. 1,000 kilometers of flight, 7 drones, and a plan that rewrote the art of modern warfare. Wars are no longer won by those with the most expensive weapons, but by those who use what they have most intelligently. And that night, Ukraine proved that even a superpower can bleed if you know where to cut.